In 1969, the British pop band The Hollies scored a worldwide top 10 hit with Bobby Scott and Bob Russell's "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother." In 1988, the song was re-released in conjunction with an ad campaign for Miller Beer, of all things, and it went all the way to number one in the UK again, this time for 2 weeks. The notion, the sentiment, though, of caring for or even carrying your sibling predates the Hollies by decades, if not centuries. All the same, though, the saying, "He ain't heavy, he's my brother," is not original to the Hollies. It first appeared in a story, in a sermon from a preacher in the United Church of Scotland in the 1880s. As the story went, the preacher recalled a time when he came across a young child struggling and straining under the weight of their younger but well-proportioned sibling. As the preacher stopped in to check and look after the child, the older sibling simply said, "Oh, he ain't heavy, he's my brother." This, by the way, in case you didn't notice, is not how the sibling dynamic played out in Genesis chapter 4. Instead, as we dive deep into these quintessential origin stories from the book of Genesis, these stories where we are intended to see ourselves, to recognize our common humanity, we're treated here in Genesis chapter 4 to a terse and tense dynamic between siblings that's maybe a little more brutally realistic. Certainly a little less idealized, a little less syrupy or sentimental than the Hollies' hit song. There is not much brotherly love going on here between Cain and Abel, quite the opposite. But anyone who's ever had a sibling, even a sibling that you love very, very, very much, knows that there's something about that dynamic, isn't there? There's something about that close sibling relationship. There's something about the rivalry. There's something about the profound level of irritation and gall even that comes from being bound so tightly together with another human being in the same family in that way. In our sermon series on the questions that God asks us, if last week's focus from Genesis chapter 3 laid bare the frayed and fragile dynamic of humanity's relationship, of our relationship with God, then here in Genesis chapter 4, this story lays bare the frayed and fragile dynamic of humanity's relationship with humanity, our relations with one another, our relations with each other, our relations with all of our siblings. And I can't imagine a text any more appropriate, any more timely than this text for this moment. Leaning a little bit on Trevor Hudson's insight into this passage from his book, there are three key insights to the story of Cain and Abel, three key takeaways from the question that God asks of Cain, "Where is your brother?" First, that this question invites us to, or challenges us to recognize our responsibilities towards those who are closest to us. Certainly our family, but more broadly speaking, our neighbors, those around us, those with whom we spend a significant amount of our time, our colleagues, our coworkers. And if we've learned one lesson, one painful lesson from the pandemic, it's that we are vastly more interdependent, vastly more interwoven with those around us than we often dare to recognize. Our lives intersect in all sorts of beautiful and serendipitous ways, and our lives actually depend on those intersections. There was a real tangible loss during the pandemic, during the lockdown, a real devastating disconnect. And I think the pandemic laid bare just how difficult it is to simulate, to emulate, to replicate the kind of care and attention, the kind of loving interaction that just happens naturally in our going about lives that makes a real difference in the lives of real people. And I still maintain that things like online classes for kids offers them something, but it's not quite the same, is it? Online classes are not quite the same as being together in a classroom and getting into trouble, right? And FaceTime or Zoom for family members, for events like anniversaries and birthdays, they simulate some of that connection and some of that connectivity, but it's still lacking something, isn't it? And then tragically, FaceTime or Zoom in those moments of great need in an ICU unit or at a deathbed, is nowhere near the same, is it? And frankly, I think we learned here at St. John's that our ability to tend to one another, to care for one another, to really love one another, what was not just hindered by the pandemic, but for some of our congregants, for some of our members, we learned we had no real mechanism for maintaining or sustaining any kind of loving or life-giving contact. We lost touch with so many folks over this time, and we're still trying to figure out, how do we love each other well? Which is one of the reasons why we formed our care team. It takes intentionality, doesn't it? It takes a certain fundamental sense of responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for those around us, especially those who aren't ours by blood, but those who are ours by choice, or those who are ours by chance. Our lives are bound up with one another, and your thriving is bound up with my thriving, and my thriving is bound up with your thriving. How are we looking after one another in such a loving way that we are all able to thrive together? And I don't know about you, but I know that I personally could do better. It's too easy, it's too tempting to just live in our little bubble, especially with technology, and ignore or deny that this fragile web of life that we are all inhabiting and navigating through every day, every moment of our lives. Is there someone in your life right now, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, an acquaintance, that God might be nudging you to check in on, to reach out to reconnect with? Do it today. Don't wait. And then, as if that weren't challenging enough, Trevor Hudson goes right for the heart. He presses a little more deeply into the story of Cain and Abel. It's not enough, is it, to care for those that we care for? It's not enough to look after the ones we happily cross paths with, or that we happily share space with. The assumption, the expectation, the implication from God asking the question, where is your brother Abel, is that we also bear responsibility for those who irritate us. We also bear responsibility for those who are different from us. We also bear responsibility for those we'd rather avoid or ignore or deny, or even try to live our lives as if they didn't exist. It's clear from this story that Cain and Abel were not simpatico. They weren't friends. They didn't have much in common other than blood. And it's doubly clear from Cain's flippant, almost hostile response. Am I my brother's keeper? Is it my job to look after him? Am I the shepherd for him? Am I the nanny or the babysitter for my brother? It's clear that Cain's disdain for Abel, his indifference about his brother, was not what God was looking for, was not what God was expecting or intending. Where is your brother Abel? God asks. And indeed, in spite of his protest, Cain did bear responsibility for his brother, didn't he? He bore responsibility for his death, certainly, but he also bore responsibility for his life, his living, his thriving. You and I bear responsibility, not just for those with whom we agree, but we bear responsibility for those with whom we disagree. The contemporary political and social notion of owning the other side, of not just winning, of not just preventing the other side from winning, of not just getting your preferred outcome, but to humiliate, to denigrate, to deny the dignity, to deny the basic humanity of the other side, it's brutal. It's just brutal. It's toxic, it's corrosive to our social fabric, and it undermines and denies our common bound-together humanity, and we're all suffering from it. The kind of gleeful, gloating, reveling that I saw on my social media feed on Friday after the Supreme Court decision, particularly from my friends and family members who claim the name of Christ, literally made me sick to my stomach for all kinds of reasons. I did not see the compassion of Christ in many of those posts. I did not see the love of Christ in many of those posts. I did not see the grace of Jesus Christ in too many of those posts. I didn't see much of anything that would help any of us answer the question, where is the one that you are responsible for? Where is the one that you are supposed to care for, especially when you differ or disagree? We are all capable of being Cain when it comes to our social and political conflicts, aren't we? Especially when it comes to social media. It's too tempting to go nuclear. It's too tempting to dehumanize and demoralize and demonize, and yet you and I bear a fundamental responsibility to each other, a responsibility that cuts across our differences, a responsibility that bridges our divides, and we pick and we tear at each other to our own peril. And we're doing it far, far too much right now, I'm afraid. And as Trevor Hudson puts it, when we see the other as the enemy, destruction follows. I'm afraid that we see too much of the enemy in the other, and destruction is following. And none of us will be untouched. We will all suffer if we aren't already suffering. Briefly, as an aside, there is, a kind of historic, tragic irony of the so-called mark of Cain, the sign that Cain bore, which according to Genesis 4, verse 15, later on in this story, was meant to protect Cain from harm, was interpreted by some historically as the darker skin, and that interpretation was then used by some Christians to justify a kind of blatant racism and brutal dehumanization of others that would lead to the slave trade, to the treatment of fellow human beings as property, as non-human or subhuman. Ironic, really, that Christians would pull out this one thread of a larger story about mutual interdependence and the need for us to care for one another no matter what, even those, especially those with whom we differ, but that they would pull out a single thread, this idea, this notion of the mark of Cain to justify their bigotry. And not just miss the whole point of the story, but to undermine the whole point of the story, to do the exact opposite of what this story is meant to teach us, that we bear responsibility for those who are different from us. And we must do better. You and I must do better. You and I are called to do better, to not miss the forest for the trees, to resist the urge to weaponize God's word or wield it as a weapon against our siblings, or to prop up and justify our own bigotry, our own ideas, our own hatred. God, help us to do better, especially to those, especially toward those, especially for those with whom we disagree and differ. The last interpretive move that Trevor Hudson reads into this story for us is perhaps the most challenging, as if these haven't been challenging enough. The question, where is your brother, invites us to recognize a certain responsibility, not just to those around us, not just merely for those with whom we disagree or differ, but also, importantly, towards the whole wide world. It's not the intentions of God. It's not the way of Christ. It's not the loving thing to be indifferent to the pain, the suffering, the injustices of the world wherever they are. That indifference is deadly. It's destructive. It's toxic to our common humanity, our bounded togetherness that defines us all. And this, I think, is one of the greatest tragedies of our tortured debates over abortion. On one side, you have those who claim a certain moral high ground by advocating for life, for protecting the vulnerable, and to a point, they have a point. And on the other side, you have those who claim a certain moral high ground by advocating for the dignity and the autonomy of women, and they, too, have a point. Of course, we should all care for life. Of course, we should all work to protect the most vulnerable among us. And of course, we should advocate for the dignity and the autonomy of everyone to make their own best reasoned choices about their own health and their own well-being. And I know, and I want to name a certain risk of hypocrisy for me to be saying these things as a man, because the debate about abortion is not something that is ever going to affect me personally. And whether or not it affects you personally or not, we are being pushed to choose sides. We are being pushed into these tried and true divisions over abortion. And when we allow that to happen, we are, I hope, trying to be generous here. We're trying to advocate and work for the well-being and the thriving of others, of someone else, the vulnerable, those who should have a right to honor and dignity and autonomy for themselves. But when the conversation, when the debate, when the rhetoric becomes one or the other, one side or the other side, the distinction, the difference between pro-life and pro-choice, and suddenly the very real messiness of life, the confounding complexity of choices, especially in these matters, are distilled into slogans and sides, winning and losing, yes and no, pro and con, and we all miss. We miss what the United Methodist Social Principles names as the tragic conflict of life with life. These issues, this matter is complicated. Life is complicated. Choices are complicated. And when we allow ourselves to oversimplify this, and we do it over and over and over again, we abdicate ourselves, we recuse ourselves, we withhold ourselves from the very real responsibilities that we bear for a wider world, for all of the world. We press our political point and we miss God's point. And suffering is the result. What feels like victory to one side does not feel like victory to the other side. In fact, will likely lead to the opposite. Winning, for one perspective, in Friday's Supreme Court ruling is going to have devastating and horrifying consequences for some. And we bear responsibility for them as well, don't we? Genesis 4 would suggest that we do. We bear responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of children currently in the foster care system. All the children who are already waiting for a loving family to adopt them, and the ones who will come. We bear responsibility for the women whose health or the health of their unborn child will become, if it hasn't already become, politicized, criminalized. We bear responsibility for the women who did not consent, for those who could not consent, and who now find themselves with child. We bear responsibility for the doctors and the medical professionals whose best judgment is now a political football, or worse, a target on their backs. You and I, although we have always had this responsibility, but you and I now bear a certain greater and certain fragile responsibility for all of these in our world. And we will be asked, not quite the same question Cain was asked, not just where is your brother, where is your sister? Where are these beloved children of God? All of them. And how will we respond?